Hello, and welcome to Part 4 of the Praxist Table Talks analysis of Julius Evola's Revolt against the Modern World. My name is Vincent, I'm the founder of Praxia, and I have with me a member of our Leadership Council, Cody.
Hello again, everybody.
How are you doing today?
Doing lovely, despite, the brutal heat of summer.
Yeah, right. Anyways, our last episode dealt with chapters 6, 7, and 8, which introduced the idea of the differentiation between the higher and lower castes by contrasting the fundamental difference in nature between the patrician castes and the plebeian castes. And then it went into the topic of spiritual virility, which remains a consistent theme throughout Evola's work, as well as other authors who also touch upon the same ideas. And then we finally closed on the idea of the two paths in the afterlife, which also reflect the two general ideas of the plebeian versus the patrician castes in that lower totemic path for the average uninitiated individual, and that higher heroic path for those greater individuals, or what we as Praxis would call that Novus Civis archetype. We have touched upon that Novus Civis archetype in the past as well. Today we will be dealing with chapters 9, 10, 11, and 12, which follow with chapter 9 being the life and death of civilizations, chapter 10 being initiation and consecration, chapter 11 being the relationship between royalty and priesthood, and then chapter 12 finally finishing it off with the topic of universality and centralism. So it seems like we'll be covering a lot today, but in reality these topics do flow all into each other quite well. But what were some of your first impressions on the topics here?
It was a very concise bridging into the last chapters, where Evola then reiterates those ideas of the demon, or daemon, but on a civilizational level now, instead of just the individual aspects and how they were incorporated in the priest class's vision of spirituality in the traditional mindset. This is also a much more technical set of chapters as well, because it's very detailed and even references more politically minded works like Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan and a few other speakers.
Yeah, I said off call
I should say. Sorry.
Oh no, you're good. Yeah, I referenced off call I mentioned off call that these chapters were very detail heavy instead of general point heavy, and that's not to say that there's not a general point to each chapter, but the details of each chapter, you know, the examples that are given, and the specific ordering of principles and operations and things like that, that he lays out in these chapters, is more the focal point than the general or broad idea itself. And it does get into the nitty gritty of things like politics and stuff like that. You know, when I initially first looked at the first chapter we're dealing with today, the life and death of civilizations, I thought that it was in reference to the yugas, which we get into later, but it really is a good preface to the idea of the yugas. But we'll kind of get into that. Do you have any kind of opening statements on the topic as a whole, or do you want to just kind of get into chapter 9?
The whole, and then 9, I guess I'll go into. On a whole, that detail really did come down to the mechanisms of civilization and the inner disputes of the higher castes of society, regardless of what society it's in, because Evola being the guy to bring all perennial tradition together in this work and looking at things across the board in this sort of objective fashion, and why they are why they're all kind of universal in a respect. That kind of he gets the formula down for these things without necessarily deviating from the spiritual aspect of civilization as we have it. And so where works like Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes, or much of the Enlightenment thinkers, or even of more contemporary thinkers to Evola in the height of the early 20th century, it was looking more at the mechanic and science of things, and not so much the essence of society that kind of exists in this soup of time that Evola is trying to distill and look at in its whole. Whereas these other political thinkers would look at the skeleton of the structure. He's looking at the entire body and how it operates in oneness. And he even makes not an allusion, a simile to the human body and how different aspects of the priest class and the king's caste kind of operate with each other in how the human body operates in reference to the rest of the body.
Right.
But getting into chapter 9, it kind of starts off with a more skeletal look, and then building up each of the organs and muscles that then create the totality of civilization, and then its lifespan,
Right.
ebbing and flowing as it goes.
Right, and that's exactly why I did I did say that these chapters go good together, because the ideas that are brought up in chapter 9 carry over very well, at least in my opinion, to chapter 10 and chapter 11 at the very least. And then chapter 12 is kind of out there on its own, but it still has it's a nice wrap up to the topics that are talked about in the 3 preceding ones. But yeah, you brought up, you were saying that Evola kind of goes one step further than all of these other figures, but the way you phrased it was political figures, at least I think. And I picked up on that because Evola himself is considered in contemporary, ideological spheres as some type of political figure, but he's really the only one on the list of people that you mentioned that deals in something beyond politics and beyond just basic psychology. Most modern philosophy can be kind of boiled down to, you got politics and interrelationships on the one hand, personal interrelationships on the one hand, and on the other hand you have an analysis of psychology. Whereas what Evola is trying to do is analyze reality and the way in which reality works, and then apply that to what we know already about, psychology or politics, or how politics or the social setup used to be, if that makes sense. So it's a completely
that's actually
paradigm.
a great point.
Okay.
Thanks. Yeah, that's actually a great point in pointing out the psychology of it, and how many thinkers of the day today, or even recently in the past, do psychologize things. And I know this is a point that Academic Agent makes on not psychoanalyzing or psychologizing your political opponents or yourselves, even, because then that just puts ulterior motives in other people's pursuits that don't really necessarily exist there, or some other form of debate tactic to try and not disenfranchise, but to discredit these ideas. And that's unhelpful. That's just trying to get internet brownie points in the grand scheme of things. But when it comes to these big ideas that kind of shape civilization, you want to avoid that altogether, because you'll just end up reasserting things like Marx or some other post-Enlightenment modernist or postmodernist that come to completely false conclusions by psychologizing things. And that's, like I said, taking the skeletal route of things, whereas Evola is looking at the entire organic picture, not just isolating individual variables within this system that we call civilization.
Right. And, if you want to take that metaphor one step further, it's like Evola's, or I guess the psychologizing of things. Well, first of all, it is a humanization of a non-human element, or a humanization of a non-human attribute or characteristic, which I think in itself is trying to establish some type of connection between the nature of reality and psychology, as if it's subjectivizing things that are objective. But if you want to take the analogy one step further, yeah, that is a type of look at the skeleton of the topic that we're dealing with, whereas Evola kind of looks at the soul beyond the skeleton. So he, it is very spiritual matters that he touches upon. I do think that we shouldn't be considering him as a political figure as he mainly is today in ideological or contemporary philosophic circles, because of his relationship with his contemporaries and all of that good stuff. He really is outside the box on that, and he's even outside the box that you can put most post-Enlightenment philosophers in, because he does get to the essence of it all. He does get to the spirit of it all, and so yeah, I think that kind of is a good summary of where we're at right now. So would you be okay with jumping into Life and Death of Civilizations?
Yeah, no, we kind of already were.
Oh, I didn't know if you.
That
When I said general overview, I meant over the whole 4 chapters. But
yeah,
never mind. I get what you're saying.
yeah,
Anyways, so now this idea, life and death of civilizations. This chapter, this kind of furthers the idea that I brought about last episode, or perhaps the episode before. I can't remember. But it was the idea of a devotional aspect to spirituality and an active participation in higher forms of being, depending on certain castes or levels of gnosis or initiation. And what I meant was that Evola claimed earlier that religion, in the current sense of the word, was nowhere to be found in the world of tradition, because religion requires a dedication to what is considered as a divine personal principle, and that religion today represents an inversion or a degradation of that original solar spirituality that the world of tradition observed. But I would characterize it a bit differently, because it's a little more complicated than that. For example, if there was I guess there was a devotional aspect to capital T traditional society in the same way that religion can be examined today, but this was reserved only for the lower castes who did not truly have that intrinsic intellectual intuition that generally provides one with a gnosis or a knowledge of the inner core of what we would call, even praxism or the principles which make up a proper tradition itself. So what you saw in the world of tradition was a lot of cults dedicated to various spiritual deities or forces or what have you that did manifest in a proper tradition, but one that was only generally effective for the lower castes who were more spiritually inept or ontologically subordinate to those of higher castes. So the purely active and solar spiritual principle was reserved for the ones who retained that spiritual virility, exhibited being that great individual, and it possessed that gnosis that was lacking in the lower castes or the lesser type of individual. So Evola writes, let's see, where is it here? He begins the chapter by saying, in those areas in which tradition retained all of its vitality, the dynastic succession of sacred kings represented an axis of light and eternity within the temporal framework, the victorious presence of the supernatural in the world, and the Olympian component that transfigures the demonic element of chaos and bestows a higher meaning to state, nation, and race. Even in the lower strata of society, the hierarchical bond created by a conscious and virile devotion was considered a means to approach and to participate in the supernatural. And that's the idea that I'm trying to convey about religion in its entirety. I won't go off too much on a tangent about that, but generally speaking, you have quite a lot of dogmatic religions which came to prominence around the time of the Middle Ages and later. And these religions can be seen in stark contrast with the figures to whom they're dedicated. For example, we have Christianity dedicated to the idea of Jesus, and then we have Jesus who actually participated in some type of higher spirituality. So the Jesus archetype is of that type, of that type of person, who it is permissible to allow beyond the rules of the dogma because they truly understand the reason for the dogma. It's almost like when a teacher lets a student slack off and then skip class because that student already has an A+ and knows the subject, but those same rules don't apply to the other students because they're sorely lacking in comparison. That's how I look at modern religion and its function. So generally speaking, the dogmatic aspect is necessary because it keeps those who truly do not understand the purpose, it keeps them virtuous and healthy and happy and what have you. But to one who understands the esoteric core of the religion, the dogma becomes secondary, and the path of the ascetic or of the solar Olympian spirituality, or what we call the Novus Civis principle, it becomes much more prominent, and that takes supremacy over the dogma. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's like separate rules for separate classes of people because you're fundamentally working with different not presuppositions, not predestinations, but
Predispositions.
Predispositions. Thank you.
Yeah.
Of mindsets of people that understand these things intuitively. I forget if it was this chapter 9 or further down in one of the other 4 chapters, but Evola even states that these are not things that can be learned. They are just qualities to be prerequisite for your initiation into this class, into this effect. And that being said, you have the more universal tones for the common man, like in these, like you were saying, the dogmatic religions, in religions like Christianity or say Islam or Hinduism with their stark caste system, and aspects to those degrees that are much different from the far more fluid and loose spiritual aesthetics of a more ancient man. And there was certainly still dogma around those traditions and those rites, rites, in those ancient societies. But they operated a bit differently, and Evola keeps making a point to delineate that, because there's a separation between a much starker separation between the upper castes in the society today than there were back then, where you would have to have a overlapping between the king and the priests and whomsoever else that were necessary at the highest end of this spiritual and political body, the head, so to speak, of the societal body that needed this communication between each other and cooperation between each other, whereas today they're seen as almost entirely separate entities. And there's even
they almost have conflicting responsibilities too. Sorry for interrupting, but they almost have conflicting responsibilities as well.
Yes.
Whereas before it seemed to be more homogenous.
That's where he brings up in the second page of this chapter Nietzsche and Beyond Good and Evil, and where the concept of conflicting or lamenting over moral degradation is already evidence of decay and decadence in general already existing in society. And so these material effects that we're seeing are already side effects of something much more deeply affecting society. That's that degeneration there from a higher form into a lower one. The involution, as Evola calls it, into the Kali Yuga. And so where we see ourselves today, we're just seeing the fallout of this disconnect between the spiritual aspect that is needed for society and the rest of the body, sort of like the soul being separated from the flesh, the demon not being present, or I guess I'm going to mess up the allegory there with the previous chapter, so I'm going to stop myself. Vincent, you want to take it over again?
Yeah, no problem. But yeah, you were kind of getting at something right there. That is right here on the second page. So page 2, he says, at this level, to leave the parameters of tradition meant to leave the true life, to abandon the rites, alter or violate the laws, or mix the castes corresponded to a regression from a structured universe or cosmos back into chaos, or to a relapse to the state of being under the power of the elements and of the totems. So, excuse me. It is that same idea where it is a regression or an involution or a type of delineation from what is actually proper and whole and true to the nature of reality, and becoming something else or something other. And in the way he puts it, leaving the true life. But this first statement here that he says that I brought up about religion. So Evola he does rectify with this statement. He rectifies his earlier statement by saying this. But the way I see it is this principle is still in effect today. It's just that the types of individual that this rule applies to, so that Novus Civis archetype, or rather the type of individual who the dogmatic rule does not apply to, is found less and less, and the world is populated almost nearly 100% with common caste individuals who do not possess that intuition or gnosis. And that's why the devotional religions are so important today. That's kind of my take on it. And it is because of that regression or involution from solar spirituality and from the type of Olympian regality that was generally enjoyed in the world of tradition, due to a number of reasons, due to caste miscegenation and an abandonment of the rites and an abandonment of what was sacred, and this idea of theory becoming more important than knowledge, and knowledge in the holistic sense of being gnosis, not necessarily just factual or empirical knowledge in the way that it's deemed today. So these are all the factors that cause this involution, and that's why you don't see very many individuals of that higher caste who can, transcend the boundaries of dogmatic religion. It's less and less common, and then the hierarchy and the just the general structure of society does not support that type of imposition or disposition anymore. And so that's one of the leading factors, I think. But this chapter,
And
go ahead.
I'd say the another large factor that Evola made a point to address too is the delineation of race as well, and how a disconnect between the race of the blood and the race of the spirit are necessary quantities to look at, and how often the race of the blood is misattributed to the decay of a civilization towards its death throes, on which this heterogeneous entropy goes on. And that's, again, just a side effect of that race of the spirit not being present or not being in alignment with the race of the blood of the people that are hosts to the civilization. And so that's a point to be made towards these neo-pagan types that are often on internet discourse now, very much still on the right-wing sphere and the traditional-minded people. I want to address that to them, that you're often conflating these old blood ties to ancient traditions that have long since been deceased because they were taken over by a more true path of like spiritual
Ascendance or
supremacy.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's, you can't betray one aspect of your history for another because the people of your ethnic heritage practice this in the much further distant past. That's only resetting yourself back down the line to where something went wrong in the first place. You got to look beyond these more antiquated notions of ethnic purity or spiraling over racial identity. They're important, but you need to have an alignment with the spiritual race and the race of the blood, like Evola states, and not just obsess over it like many people do, I see in online spheres. It often ends up to where our opposition, the people we don't want in power anymore, utilizing that as a tool against us and saying all sorts of things that we want ethnic cleansings or racial superiorities or things like that, because they themselves are also looking at the material aspects of this world. And these neo-pagan white nationalist types are doing the same thing, just in the opposite way. And both sides are part of the Kali Yuga that are just devolving into these material obsessions. And what's the cure for that is that spiritual realignment to make sure that people aren't clashing over vanity, which I know it's going to be a bit controversial, but for all it's worth, everything you see in the realm of race today in society is skin deep. And the people are going to say, oh no, but what about these racial factors and phenotypes and genetic predisposition stuff? You're not getting it. That's still material function that's separated from the spiritual function.
Yeah.
You gotta reconnect the two.
Separated and or a product of that most people don't consider. Because there's this idea in the world of tradition that everything that is a material factor or a material component of reality is a result of something that was ordained metaphysically, which means that it was ordained in the world of things that are, in which no event actually transpires. There is no transpiration of any event within the realm of metaphysicality. So if that were the case, that means that everything that is in the realm of metaphysics is in fact truth, meaning that anything that results from that directly, so something like disposition or preordainment or something like that, any material factor which is understood to be the result of metaphysics, is itself a lesser version of that truth, but is still a truth itself if it adheres to the guidelines set for it by its metaphysical component. So all of these physical factors, you might say like, oh, well, like you were bringing up like, oh, genetics this and, the phenotypes that and all of that stuff. That's considered to be that manifestation of that metaphysical principle, not the point of focus itself. The point of focus is that principle which it is supposed to adhere to, but a loyalty or a valuation of that form itself, disconnected from its metaphysical principle, might as well be attaining or attaching value to something that is worthless in a sense. And that it is kind of controversial to say because, no matter how you look at it, people do have this view of race as almost the it is kind of that lesser individual type of that material expression of self instead of that inner knowledge of who oneself is. It's that material and atomistic absorption rather than that archetypal ascendance. And so
it's the poor man's tribalism.
Yeah.
And it kind of devolves down to it is a devolved down version itself from that spiritual ascension, but it also uses the sciences to justify it on both sides as well. The progressivist sides, the transhumanist NWO, and the parts of the neo-reactionary sides as well, which then only obfuscate our goals further down the line and get in our own way. And we need to not do that so we don't make the same mistakes as our opponents right now, because everything's falling apart around us because of that scientism and material justification and emphasis they put on things that we have to not necessarily avoid, but reconvene with that spiritual justification and proper attunement.
Before we get too far into the discussion of race, I do want to kind of detail this chapter itself is, as the name suggests, it's about the life and death of civilizations, and so his thesis is just to give the general idea. He says, among various writers, de Gobineau is the one who probably better demonstrated the insufficiency of the majority of the empirical causes that have been adduced to explain the decline of the great civilizations. He showed, for instance, that a civilization does not collapse simply because its political power has been either broken or swept away. Not even the quality of the governments, in the empirical sense of the word, exercises much influence on the longevity of civilizations. De Gobineau remarked that civilizations, just like any living organism, may survive for a long time, even though they carry within themselves disorganizing tendencies in addition to the spiritual unity that is the life of the one common tradition. India and feudal Europe, for example, show precisely the absence of both a unitary organization and a single economic system or form of legislation on one hand, and a marked pluralism with repeatedly recurring antagonisms on the other. And so that's this idea of the life of a civilization is being attached to something that is greater than something that would be attributed today to politics or legality or policy or something of that more empirical or more physical nature. Whereas, like I said, Evola was kind of attributing it to these more spiritual factors. He goes on to say, not even the so-called corruption of morals, in its most profane and moralistic bourgeois sense, may be considered the cause of collapse of civilizations. So, as we see today, so many on the traditionalist sphere, or in the traditionalist sphere, say, we need a more moral society. What he's saying is that this consideration of morality is already a step down because it is trying to attach a subjective worldview to something that is objective. So he says, the corruption of morals may at most be an effect, but it is not the real cause. And so this is something that most traditionalists do not consider themselves, or self-proclaimed traditionalists don't consider. In almost every...
it's the... Oh, sorry.
He just to finish up, he says, in almost every instance we have to agree with Nietzsche, who claimed that wherever the preoccupation with morals arises is an indication that a process of decadence is already at work. And so...
that's the quotation I brought up a little before. It's the addressing of the symptoms and trying to cure it as if that's the whole problem in and of itself. But they are just symptoms to the degenerative disease that is afflicting society overall.
Yeah.
And that's why most in the right-wing sphere are failing on a I guess, political front, because it's not addressing the actual root of the problems.
Yeah,
it's just addressing the symptoms.
And that's why the moral argument itself is subordinate to the true spirituality or the adherence to traditional principles. So there's this idea of the law and the way, and when conforming to traditional doctrine, there's the law, which is that exoteric, it's the dogmatic form of the tradition, Excuse me. And then there's the way, which is the esoteric, or the inner understanding of the tradition itself, the principles behind the tradition, which is why Evola himself is an esotericist, because he gets at that spiritual form, or that spiritual essence behind the physical form of a tradition. And so there's that idea of adhering to the law, but one must understand the way, and that is going, the law would be that moral framework, and the way would be understanding beyond that moral framework, or the reasons for that moral framework. But again, he talks about the true way to understand moral decay within a society, and that way would be to understand it as a symptom of a civilizational collapse and not the cause of it. And so then he goes on to talk about his idea of race, and his ideas of race have a lot of detail to them, and I don't think that here's the best place to get into them too deeply, but generally speaking, in the same way that he separated the individual into three beings in the chapter about the afterlife, his view on race was very similar. He separated race into three categories. There was the race of the body, there was the race of the soul, and then there was the race of the spirit. And the race of the body he considered to be less important and even subordinate to one's spiritual race, or to the race of their soul, which generally amounted to the style in which one expressed themselves. So it's that, materialistic orientation, or that materialistic expression of self. And the spiritual stock, or the caste to which one has a predisposition to participate in. So here he says, the unity and purity of blood are believed by some to be the foundation of life and the strength of a civilization. Therefore, the mixing and ensuing poisoning, quote-unquote, of the blood are considered the initial cause of a civilization's decline. This, too, is an illusion, which, among other things, lowers the notion of civilization to a naturalistic and biological plane, since this is the plane on which race is thought of in our day and age. Race, blood, hereditary purity of blood. These are thought of in these are material factors. In a civilization in the true traditional sense of the word arises only when a supernatural and non-human force of a higher order, a force that corresponds to the pontifical function, to the component of the right, and to the principle of spirituality as the basis of a hierarchical differentiation of people, acts upon these factors. So, he goes on to compare the care for biological purity in a given civilization to that of breeding dogs or horses. But he differentiates that with the human principle, first of all because what Evola is dealing with is a worldview in which the animalistic aspect of humanity is an effect of a decay or a degradation in the quality of being in which humans participate. And so this is antithetical to the evolutionist worldview in which humanity at present, right now, is at its historic, intellectual, and physical height. And second of all, because the humanity possesses a divine element to it that is not present in animals, and so the criteria of a perfect animal is different than a perfect man, because an animal is the physical dispositions and actions are considered to be the causes and effects themselves, whereas in humanity these are only effects of a higher spiritual cause that takes place either from the demon, which was talked about earlier, or the spirit of a given stock of people, or initiation, or really a list of spiritual factors which don't come into the conversation of that materialistic orientation. He goes as far as to say, let's see here. So he goes as far as to say, when this quote-unquote something, so he's talking about an essence that is transmitted through the blood, when this something is truly powerful, or when it constitutes the deeper and most stable nucleus of a traditional civilization, then that civilization can preserve and reaffirm itself, even when ethnical mixtures and alterations occur, no matter how destructive they may be, by reacting on the heterogeneous elements and shaping them by reducing them slowly but gradually to their own type, or by regenerating itself into a new, vibrant unity. In historic times, there are a number of cases of this. And so he uses this to reaffirm the stability of multi-ethnic traditional civilizations, such as India, Rome, Persia, and so on, where, generally speaking, the ethnic factor is considered subordinate to the spiritual factor. So he doesn't attribute the decay of a society to its loss of biological identity, which is how race is understood in modernity. However, he does attribute the death of a civilization to its loss of its spiritual race, especially in the highest castes and the most prominent citizens. So back again, I talked about the disappearance or the impossibility of there being a regality today. He attributes that to to the decay of a civilization. And this is one of the main reasons he's connected with racialism too, because people fundamentally misunderstand this argument that the decay in a spiritual race is one of the leading causes or symptoms of a decaying society. He also equates this with secularization and humanizations. And he also reaffirms the importance of the regal function in kings and pontifical figures. Once the titles of regality or of the mediators between divinity and temporality lose that divine aspect and become purely temporally representative, that's a crumbling of one of the pillars of a given civilization, which leads into its decay. So again, this chapter was titled Life and Death of Civilizations, and this kind of precedes the idea of the Doctrine of the Ages, which is a title of a later chapter that deals with the Yugas. But this chapter deals more with the fundamental ideas of a life of a civilization and the death of a civilization. So the factors that contribute to a civilization's life or vitality are the same factors that have been detailed throughout this book, namely regality, caste hierarchy, the proper state hierarchy, the maintenance of rights, what have you. Then the factors that would contribute to a civilization's death would also be the inverse of that. So caste miscegenation, or an orientation towards the plebeian, or a neglect of the rights, or a dissolution of the spiritually virile race, and so on. So that's kind of how this chapter wraps itself up. Any closing statements on this one?
I guess a transitory statement to the next chapter is what you said in quoting Evola there with the historical aspects of things in heterogeneous civilizations in the past. It's not the losing of biological identity, it's the spiritual legitimacy that they have. And part of that is also not just losing touch with that spirituality altogether, like we have in today's society, people becoming atheistic or agnostic, or having a very loose sense of spirituality that is completely vain and incongruent with what is actually needed for people to have these more fulfilling aspects of their nature or of society overall. It's the perceived legitimacy of the spirituality that exists within a society as well. Whereas, something like the Christian ethos still has a supreme spiritual legitimacy, but its perception has come under fire from so many different points of direction, which has kind of disillusioned much of the populations across the West, especially, into a sort of subversive death spiral. And that's what we're seeing now as well. And so that's why it brings back around to the neo-pagans, where you see a lot of these people rejecting this orientation of spiritual legitimacy into a further representation in their perceived past, something more material that they can hold on to instead of this more ethereal concepts that you see in Christianity. Yeah. And that's why we have that degeneration.
And it's funny you mention that because spirituality and religion and all of that good stuff, initiation often has a lot to do with memory, but not in a literal sense.
Yeah, and that's what that point was on people having that predisposition in going into this initiation and consecration, because it's something that kind of you're just born with. It's not like you have to actualize it as well, but you can't not have it and still ascend to these higher castes or maintain these positions of power and legitimacy like a king. Because in this chapter 10, Evola brings in different people like Charlemagne and other kings who sort of crowned themselves alongside with the priestly caste that gave that legitimacy to them to rule through the right, the RIT.
Yeah.
And that's why it has that stability and legitimacy that people can keep playing into without everything falling apart.
And also, there's this idea of it's kind of like a two-step process, right? It's like you have to be born with the quality, and you have to then activate the quality. And that activation is what is considered as an initiation. And the general idea of initiation as a whole is that everyone has some type of activatable quality that is latent within them. Whether that quality is of a regal nature is kind of a different question. So to ascend to that regal caste, you have to be born with that regal disposition, but then also activate that regal disposition through initiation or through a consecration of sorts by a priestly body. And so this chapter, it kind of deals with the idea of initiation, but most importantly, the initiation of kings or of regal leaders, especially in contrast with leaders who do not require an initiation because they were already born with the correct ontological status, which can be reached as a lesser being through initiation. So there's this idea that initiation changes or raises the ontological status of a being to something higher than it once was. And in degenerated or involuted forms of humanity, this initiation is required because the ontological status of humanity is lower than what it was in the days of tradition or in the regal caste itself, the uninitiated regal caste itself, or the caste itself which does not require an initiation. So this chapter also deals with the difference between initiation and consecration, as the name of the chapter suggests, with initiation being the trial, which is undergone by a proposed ruler to activate that latent quality within himself, and that then he will wholly embody the regal principle. And then with consecration being a rite of investiture, similar to that of medieval kings and so on. So he begins... go ahead.
And it is a two-way street, like we mentioned previously, with the overlap between the caste of regality and the caste of priestliness, because there is like it's the title of the chapter suggests, consecration for this priestly caste being derived from the legitimacy of the crown itself too. So it's kind of a feedback loop into each other. One kind of needs the other in order to have a sort of legitimacy and healthy perpetuation, and why we see today with the separation and ancillary directions of the two, that we have so much conflict in society, because that spiritual aspect and that I guess lack of regal aspect in the political nature butt heads or degenerate further down the line for their own material gain.
Yeah. So he begins this chapter with, he says, the regal idea occurs in an already weakened form when it no longer becomes incarnated in kings who are naturally above human limitations. So again, there is this idea of the regal, or I guess the primordial being, or the primordial race of beings before the decayed version of humanity came about. Generally before the time after the fall, which is characterized by Adam and Eve, or by Olympus, or not Olympus, the other one, Atlantis, or something of where there was a higher caste or a higher type of humanity that was common throughout an entire piece of land, to transitioning into a time when that type is no longer around, or if it is around, it needs to be activated. So again, he references those beings. Anyway, he says it occurs in an already weakened form when it no longer becomes incarnated in kings who are naturally above human limitations, but rather in beings who must develop this quality within themselves. In the ancient Hellenic tradition, such a distinction corresponded analogically to that between a god and a hero. So the god would be the one who is obviously born a god, and then the hero would be one who has to become a god through a type of initiation. And he mentions the same idea for the Egyptian races as well. And this is a common theme found throughout various traditions of initiation, especially in a regal and in a leadership sense. And it also corresponded to the gods and the heroes of the Greeks. So, with regards to initiation, there are various different methods he mentions which correspond to different traditions. Most commonly, the process of initiation generally meant undergoing a certain rite, very similar to the rites which were maintained by the patricians, or by the priestly caste, or even by the king once he underwent this initiation himself. And this would be a reenactment of the action which was taken by a spiritual ancestor or a god, depending on civilization and circumstance. For example, the Egyptian king reenacted the sacrifice of Osiris as the most prominent example. However, rites were by no means simple, and they generally always had multiple steps to them, and each step corresponded to a certain stage within the initiation itself, which never truly completed. So, remember, the idea of initiation is subordinate to the idea of regality. And so what this means is that the initiated king or the initiated regal figure is inferior to the born regal figure. And so part of the reason that the rites needed to be maintained was because the inferior nature of the individual in question needed some type of divine sustenance or support, which was transposed onto that individual through the process of the rite, if that makes sense. So he also describes Oh, go ahead.
It's reinforcing the legitimacy to the claim. It's not a meritocratic process because, like we said, these people need to have had a predisposition towards this structure or this position in order to even be given the chance to commit this ritual or rite in the first place. And you can say it's a bit of a formality, but it's not, because it still took great lengths and difficulty to complete, but it's something that everyone knew that the right person would complete regardless, by the act of it being the rite in the first place. And so that's why these rituals and consecrations are the way they are, to give anyone who has a claim to be a priest or a king or whatever have you, and make them go through the trial to prove that that claim holds up.
Yeah, and this does sound like meritocracy on the surface, because it does take a certain qualification to be designated a certain position within society, but that qualification is a spiritual qualification that is determined by the priestly caste, or it's not as simple as that, but it boils down to being determined by the priestly caste. Whereas meritocracy implies that something has already been done. So the idea of regality, or the idea of spiritual ordainment, is something that is to come or yet to be, which is reflected by stuff that has already passed, that has not been done by the individual in question. So think of like a prince who comes from a long line of successful kings, who has that quality within him, but has not done anything himself to be worthy of being a king, but still it is generally accepted that he is to be the king because he has that quality within himself, observably. And obviously that is, in part, the duty of the priestly caste to kind of identify that characteristic and bring it to light. So,
in the on page 66.
Oh,
I just had a quote real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
On page 66 of the chapter, there's the anonymous author of York, which Evola quotes as, "The king, the Christ, aka the anointed, of the Lord cannot be regarded as being a layman," and that's end quote there.
Sorry, I'm coming to the page. Oh, I see. Yeah, the king, the Christ, anointed of the Lord, cannot be regarded as being a layman. Yeah, it's that same type of idea. So you have that idea of regality being something that is yet to be, but already has been, whereas meritocracy is strictly a consideration of the accomplishments, the material accomplishments, I might add, of the individual himself. So, does the prince deserve to be a king because of the material accomplishments that he has achieved in his time as, in his time of being alive, or does he deserve kingship because of that quality within him, which tells, society at large, or which tells reality, or which tells God, or however you want to detail it, that he is fit to be the king. So that's why it's not like meritocracy, and so that's what differentiates it from meritocracy as well. And there's a lot of confusion around it, because it does make sense when you say that a person is qualified to do something. It's generally considered in modern times a result of their merit, and merit meaning something that has been done in the past, something that has been done in the recent personal past, whereas we're talking about something larger, something that is almost outside of time. And so that's the differentiating factor there. Do you have anything to add before I kind of move on? Not to the next chapter. Okay.
Yeah, I'm ready to move too.
So he also talks about the Eleusinian rite of regality rather in depth, and this rite holds quite a lot of symbolic value, and the king kind of needs to undergo specific steps which correspond to certain symbols. And one of the most important aspects of initiation he details here is, in essence, initiation is irreversible. And so he talks about, let me go find it. He talks about, here we go. And an echo of this notion was preserved in the Catholic view, according to which the priestly dignity, which is transmitted sacramentally, cannot be effaced by any moral sin committed by the person endowed with it, since it remains in that person as an indoles indelibilis, or an indelible mark. So the quote here is, "You are a priest forever." So it gives this idea, in essence, that initiation is irreversible, and so the quality bestowed upon the individual by the process of initiation is impossible to truly tarnish. However, the rites do still need to be maintained so that this continuity between the divine and the temporal, or between the initiate and the quality bestowed by initiation itself, doesn't decay or dim or become lesser. So it can't be done away with, but it still requires maintenance. For example, you won't lose your arms if you don't work out, but your arms will become stronger if you do. It's that same way. You won't lose the quality bestowed upon you by initiation, but if you don't actively exercise that quality by maintaining the rites, your effect by using that quality will be kind of tarnished. It will have less strength to it. So do you have anything to add?
No, I'm kind of almost ready to move on to the next chapter.
Okay. Let's see. Now he says here, "Let us now examine the case of kings who have not been raised to a super-individual dignity through initiation, but rather through an investiture or a consecration that is mediated by a priestly caste. This form is typical of more recent historical times. The primordial theocracies did not derive their authority from a church or from a priestly caste. The Nordic kings were kings immediately by virtue of their divine origin, just like the kings of the Doric Achaean period." I never can pronounce that word. They were the only celebrants of sacrificial actions. And this is the first indication of what, in my opinion, Evola gets wrong. And this is expounded upon more in the next chapter, but even now, he goes on to the second part of this chapter, which is consecration. And so what he's getting at here is actually more or less agreeable. And it references what I talked about way back at the beginning when I was talking about religion. Remember when I said that the devotional religions are more important today because the castes of individuals which transcend the necessity for dogma and devotion is no longer around? That same idea extends to the theocracy and to the rite of investiture, or to the consecration of kings. The rite of investiture, by the priestly institution given to an individual who exercises that regal function, is necessary in more recent times, because the individuals who do not require this investiture can no longer be found. However, when the priestly caste itself sees itself as the only regal authority, this is when the problems arise. So generally speaking, this is agreeable, but under certain conditions. But these conditions I think we should talk about kind of going into the next chapter. So before we begin chapter 11, which is titled "On the Hierarchical Relationship Between Royalty and Priesthood." Now this chapter deals with one of Evola's more controversial opinions among religious scholars and philosophers, and there is a lot to unpack here. So let's go through the chapter and take a look at what Evola says on the subject, and then I will bring a few other opinions into the mix to try to explain this issue external to Evola's particular writings here. So there was a book by René Guénon titled "Spiritual Authority and Temporal Power," and what Guénon commented on in that book is the topic of this chapter also. So spiritual authority being the priestly caste or the priestly initiation, and temporal power it being that type of royalty or the exercised regal function on earth, if that makes sense. Do you have anything to add before we go on?
No.
Okay. So Evola starts off by saying, let's see. If on the one hand the original synthesis of the two powers is re-established in the person of the consecrated king, on the other, the nature of the hierarchical relationships existing in every normal social order between royalty and priestly caste or church, which is merely the mediator of supernatural influences, is very clearly defined. Regality enjoys primacy over the priesthood, just as, symbolically speaking, the sun has primacy over the moon and the man over the woman. Now, what he's saying here is that royalty, or the regal caste, is above the priestly caste on the hierarchy in the sequence of functions exhibited by both castes, because ultimately, the regal individual is one who is an embodiment of the divine, while the priestly caste is merely the interpreter of the will of the divine. And so the priestly caste may be able to hold royal power in reserve for someone of a regal stature, but they would never be able to exercise that function themselves. And so what he's implying here is that, well, I guess as we go on, he goes on to say, when referring to thoroughly traditional civilizations, it is helpful to employ Aryan or Indo-Aryan texts in order to emphasize that even in a civilization that appears to be characterized mainly by the priestly caste, the notion of the correct relationship between the two dignities was preserved to a large extent. Again, this is still generally agreeable. In these texts, which I have previously quoted, it is said that the stock of the warrior deities arose from Brahman as a higher and more perfect form than Brahman itself. And so, this is the first deviation of what I think and what Genon thinks, and what a lot of people in religious or theological circles thinks that he gets wrong, which is this: there's this attribution of the warrior caste to the regal function or the regal idea, which I guess I can talk about that as we go on a little bit more. But the rest
it's kind of what we've already touched on. I guess we were getting ahead of ourselves in the previous two chapters.
We kind of were, yeah.
Explained most of this along the way.
Yeah.
It's just more detail in the history thereof, and that continuation of tradition of the regality over the priestly caste to a degree. Because, like we said, it's a feedback loop to each other. As far back as the ancient Egyptians to even to the 17th century with Basuet, a bishop that Evola quotes further in the chapter, kind of declaring that a sovereign regality, a legitimate crowned king or emperor of some sort, is God's divine image on earth, and their rule is law. Even beyond death, their authority doesn't die, to paraphrase.
Yeah. And so what he's implying here is that regality is intrinsically linked to the warrior caste and not the priestly caste, and that therefore the warrior caste generally should have some type of supremacy over the priestly caste. And so he goes, we come across a few civilizations here, or a few characterizations here, and he's characterizing the warrior caste as a masculine entity and the priestly caste as a type of feminine entity, since in traditional symbolism, the masculine principle is the independent principle and, generally speaking, the superior one. And so this would place the quote-unquote the warrior regality, as he calls it, over and above the priestly caste. This is what I think is the fundamental flaw in his thinking, is that he attaches himself to this notion of caste as if it were something that is super rigid throughout the world of tradition, which it's not. The idea of a caste being present is all across the same, up into the medieval world as well. But the idea of there being four distinct castes rather than almost a type of overlap in function between castes, as well as there being possibly more than four castes, or a possible infinite amount of smaller castes that fall within four general categorizations. This is what I consider to be the problem, because he doesn't take that into consideration. And so
it could also be argued there could be as little as two.
Yeah, and that would be the patrician and the plebeian. So it is a type of argument, but generally speaking, for Evola's doctrine himself, or for Evola's doctrine itself, he aligns himself with the idea of four castes, which is priestly, warrior, common, and then, or merchant, whatever you want to phrase it, and then slave or laborer. And so of these four, you can only attribute regality to one of them. So if it's not the priestly caste, because the priestly caste holds regality or holds the power of royalty in reserve for one who assumes the regal function, then that must mean that it is the warrior caste who assumes this regal function, because the holder of a royal title most often or maybe enacts the warrior principle. But I think this is a little bit of naivety on his part, because Guénon makes the consideration that the priestly caste is superior. I also think that this is a little bit of a naivety on his part, because like we talked about before, all of these things kind of overlap, and there's some gray areas in between. There's some blend here and there between the functions. But the idea of regality itself, or of the perfect king, or of the manifestation of the divine on earth, is beyond caste. It's not limited to caste. And so to say that the warrior caste is the regal caste is kind of an involution or a confusion of what regality is actually supposed to be, which is beyond caste, or superior to caste, or some type of manifestation of all the castes, including the ones that aren't accounted for in the top tiers. And so that's what I don't think he gets at. So he's right in saying that regality is superior to the priestly caste, in my opinion. This is all me speaking. I think he's right in saying that regality is superior to the priestly caste because it is a manifestation of the divine. But how you get to being regal, I disagree with. I don't think you get there from being a warrior caste. I think you get there from having that disposition in whatever caste you may be born into, or you're born outside of a caste and you still need to activate that type of quality within yourself. So it
is funny though, because if you were done there.
Yeah, I was. Go ahead.
That in chapter 9 he did mention, or 10, sorry, he did mention the point that in some totemic traditions there was the selection of a king from the warrior caste consecrated by the priestly caste. And once they did become king, they were both warrior and priest at the same time and stayed as such throughout their reign. So it might have been an oversight on him, or a slight contradiction in his part too, but maybe he just has this idealized vision of the warrior caste being in power. But I am very much of the same thought that you are, that warrior and priestly caste both have the same legitimacy and the same status to each other, like the shoulders upon which the head rests, but it takes one or the other to get that head itself, that crown, to be in the regal position, and then they become both in a way. They become that center ground, that navel, as you will, between the right and the left of the priest and the warrior, if we're looking at it like a head and shoulders type of situation,
right, with
the rest of the body being beneath and supporting it.
Right. And yeah, that's so it's funny that you bring that up, because I think he also, just like I said, how he has that loyalty to form a little bit when it comes to an identification of the castes, where he specifically is loyal to, or he holds a certain loyalty to the idea of 4 castes, with no amount of overlap or no gray areas, a very rigid system. And so I think that might be the same idea, because he will employ texts that bring up that the warrior, or that the regal title holder, I guess you could say, the regal manifestation was selected from the warrior caste. Yeah, that's all well and fine, because I do think that the process can manifest that way, but I don't think that the principle or the essence of the process is strictly confined to regality being taken from the warrior caste. It could be taken from the priestly caste as well. It could be taken from someone who is, like I said, outside of caste. And so the texts that he employs to support it, they are valid insofar as they are contextual to their own tradition, but they are invalid insofar as they are contextual to the idea or the essence of the tradition. Because we can also look at other texts or other examples in which the priestly caste was considered to be superior to the warrior caste. And so I think that that's just kind of a slight differentiation, or a slight, like I said, naivety on him, or maybe an unwillingness to budge on something that he thinks he sees that maybe we don't see. Maybe he's making different considerations than us. I just think that that's it. That's we should bring it up in this episode.
That's very true. I think the best way to wrap it up and then move on is looking at it as the warrior and the priest having respective roles to each other that they both need. Because the priest is more theory and direction, and the warrior is more action and fulfillment. And you can't really have one without the other. You can, but then that turns into chaos or stagnation.
Yeah, and he actually
And
does bring
neither
up later
are
on.
good.
He does bring up later on about what happens if you have an unchecked masculine or warrior society, one that is unchecked by a priestly caste. And I think he might even bring up what happens if you have an unchecked priestly caste. So he
Yes,
does.
because he's very critical on Christianity, on that unchecked priestly caste,
Yeah.
and the overriding of the feminine of the masculine in these days.
Yeah. So he does go back and detail what happens if you don't have one without the other. But the process of how you get from one to regality, I think, is what he does. I think he doesn't consider the larger picture. That's my critique on it. But kind of wrapping that up. The next chapter here is chapter 12. It's universality and centralism. And this is not the centralism of, like politics today where you might consider yourself a centrist. This is not what he's referring to. I've had a conversation with a dude before who used this chapter's title as an argument that Evola was a centrist or a radical centrist or something like that. I was flabbergasted. I couldn't believe it. So yes, universality and centralism is not centrism. It's not political centrism. It's an idea of a central pivot point. It's kind of like the idea of polar symbolism and stuff like that. It goes beyond politics, number one. But I was just flabbergasted. Anyways, so yeah, this chapter deals with universality and centralism, and this idea of a as the title of the chapter suggests, is this idea of a universal order or a universal center to a given people. It talks a lot about the idea of the empire or the imperial principle, which is touched upon a little bit earlier in the book, but a little bit later as well. And it also deals with the idea of civilizational, not loyalty, but that relationship of the blood to the idea of the civilization. It talks about the intrinsic continuity from physical personhood to nation to race to regality to so on and so forth. So he starts off by saying the ideal of the Holy Roman Empire points out the decadence. The principle of regere or ruling is liable to undergo when it loses its spiritual foundation. He says, in the Ghibelline ideal of the Holy Roman Empire, two beliefs were firmly upheld: that the regnum had a supernatural origin and a metapolitical and universal nature. So, that the idea of the empire was something other than a merely political organization. And that the emperor, as the lex animata in terris, and as the peak of the ordinatio ad unum, was aliquod unum quod non est pars, and the representative of a power transcending the community he governed. In the same way, the empire should not be confused with any of the kingdoms and nations that it encompassed, since in principle it was something qualitatively other, prior, and superior to each of them. So, what he's talking about when he says that the idea of the empire is prior to the nations that it encompassed, what he means is that it comes sequentially prior in this given sequence that exists in the eternal now, beginning from something that is supernatural, or even from the monad itself, if you want to get back into monism. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the empire existed before the nation or before the physical bodies, but that it exists sequentially prior or sequentially first, and so it has that type of it has a superior type of importance to it. So
it brings it back.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
It brings it back to the idea of the totemic instantiation of these things and the legitimacy of power going on that plane. And so once you have a larger power beyond just physical force legitimizing it, then that legitimacy is conceded to that higher, more central authority, and that's where the empire comes in over an individual nation or locality or a prince to a feudal lord, and so on and so forth. It's all totemic down the line to the from the slave all the way up to the emperor.
Yep. He goes on saying, ideally speaking, the various kingdoms were not supposed to be united to the empire through a material bond, whether of a political or military nature, but rather through an ideal or spiritual bond, which was expressed by the characteristic term fides, which in medieval Latin had both a religious meaning and a political meaning, and moral meaning, of faithfulness or devotion. So, the idea of the empire was one that had the loyalty of its nations not based around any material factor, but based around some type of spiritual factor, some type of spiritual loyalty to the empire, whether it be because they are of the same, because they share some type of historic bond, or because they share some type of spiritual, what am I looking for here? Spiritual sameness, I guess, if that makes sense. Spiritual cooperation, that's the term I'm looking for. Whether through be some type of like hierarchical imposition, whatever it may be, there's this idea of a spiritual loyalty of the nation to the empire, and then this empire is a meta-regional. It's not even supposed to be considered something that is regional, but something that is qualitatively something else. It is not supposed to be a political entity itself. It's supposed to be a more spiritual centralizing force. And so that's why the chapter is called Universality and Centralism. And the topic of this chapter today, the topic of this chapter right here, it comes in contrast to a lot of what we would hear in general right-wing spheres, especially of the traditionalist sort, where there's this idea that there is supposed to be no universality, there is supposed to be no type of leveling, or I don't want to say equality, because that's not the right term here. But there's no
equalizing.
Yeah, there's no equalizing force or unifying force that is universal or that is not relative. And so that's where I think the fundamental flaw with modern traditional thought comes in, is that they are so opposed to anti-globalism, and with good reason, that they are shunning anything that has any type of universalist quality to it, because that universalism has been considered to be the deteriorating factor of modern civilization, whereas before it was the unifying, all-encompassing nature of the essence of tradition around a given nation. So it's two different ways of looking at universalism. One in which... Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, you finish.
I was going to say, it's two different ways of looking at universalism. One in which universalism is regarded materially and atomistically, in the sense that everyone is lowered to a certain level, and then one in the sense where it is considered spiritually or qualitatively, in which individuals are able to participate in a certain universal order in the way in which they are predisposed and preordained to. You were going to say something?
It's the orientation of universality from above as opposed to below.
Yeah, exactly.
What is concerning the right-wing spheres today, and what people like neo-pagans or others of the sort, because it's not just them either, I don't want to pick on them for eternity, criticize Christianity for, in this pursuit of universalism that Christianity does have, is that they are attributing it as the justification or the prerequisite for what the NWO or those in power today utilized to push the globo homo as they have it. But that's a misattribution of the root of the problem. The NWO, the Cathedral Babylon, however you want to call it, is this universalism from below, where it is taking the material and making it a simulacrum of the wheel coming around towards the center, whereas from above, it is that hub, as Evola puts it, holding everything together and then dispersing it out naturally, and where legitimacy comes from in this universal point. So the legitimacy to universality really depends on the direction that it's coming from.
Yeah.
And that's why you can't just look at something that is universal and immediately assume it's bad. It's what direction is being pointed in that should make that determination. And that's kind of what Evola gets at a little bit here too.
Yeah, it's that addition of the third dimension to what is originally a 2D diagram of sorts. The equalizing factor here, or the universal factor, I guess you could say, is not one that is supposed to be regarded as one that is essentially equitarian, in that everyone involved is of an equal status, but one in which the various statuses have an equal importance in a given order. So, if there were no common caste, let's say, if there were no labor caste, let's say, that would then the regal or the priestly or the warrior caste would not be able to be sustained. It's that type of order. But apply that to something that is beyond nation or beyond region or beyond ethnic boundaries even, and you get a spiritual order that is partaken in by almost everybody. This is what the idea of tradition was getting at. And so Evola obviously supports this idea because he supports the idea of perennialism, which is in a sense a universalist traditionalism. And we kind of get at this because we have the principle of praxism that we talk about, which is essentially a universalist essence that becomes manifested by these various traditions or worldviews or life practices or what have you. So it's the same general idea. What he's trying to do is abstractify all of the formalities, all of the things that are embodied by various forms. So abstractify the nation into an essence, abstractify the tradition into an essence. Abstractify the people into an essence almost, and you get this universal order. And again, that has a central authority to it because it is hierarchical, it is three-dimensional, and that would be what the idea of the emperor is. So the emperor is not supposed to be a king of a bigger piece of land than a kingdom. He's supposed to be someone who has the imperial title because he is a manifestation of the regal principle. So that's why the idea of the Roman emperor was so important, or of the Greek emperor, or of the Egyptian emperor, or even if you look at Charlemagne, or the medieval emperors like the Byzantine Empire, or if you look at the idea of the Aztec Empire, or even the Chinese Empire, the emperor himself was seen as the supreme regal figure because he had that spiritual authority over his empire, whether or not he had any type of material or temporal power to carry out his authority. And by virtue of them adhering to their tradition, they obeyed this authority, whether or not he, again, had the material capacity to carry out this authority. So it's a reciprocal relationship that is partaken in this idea of universality. And it's also, like you said, Cody, it is a leveling of sorts, or an equalizer of sorts, in the sense that when one tradition or one empire coincides with another, the idea is that one eventually becomes absorbed into another by taking on the certain formal qualities or manifestations of the other into which it is being absorbed. So it has a lot of there's a lot of nuance to it, and there's a lot of trying to understand it. But that's the general principle of universality and centralism. Do you kind of have anything to say before I get into that?
To have two examples to further demonstrate that abstraction, so people kind of get it, especially for my more materialist, futurist, and technocratic types out there that may be listening to this. Think of it as in our today's society, where our leaders, no matter what nation you live under, the figureheads at the top of our societies don't really hold any spiritual significance or even material significance that anyone believes in anymore. It's so much illusion and fakery and enforcing of the issue that everyone is just seeing the status of the empire we have it, the global American empire, or even further beyond that, being delegitimized by the day because there's no centrality to its authority. Even though it is a universal concept, it's from the bottom up, and that's why you can have people like Biden, or what's his name, Trudeau, or whomever else, whatever world leader you want to point to, and they be given teleprompters and being told what to say, even though theoretically they are the modern equivalent of regality for these nations. But there is some empirical or empire sourced authority over them on which they are getting their directives from. They are merely the principalities under which that centrality is derived. But because it's derived from this material upbringing, there's no real legitimacy to it, and that's why it's more obfuscated than just out in the open. But on another point, you could look at it as a planetary way to really make the allegory truly universal. If human colonies start propping up in the near or late future, and there's different legitimacies to the human empire as you have it, the Earth will be this new central point in totality from which all these other colonies across the universe will have their legitimacy originating from, because that is the origin of human life so far as we know it.
That's actually a really good analogy or example of how this principle works. Yeah, there's this idea. Evola used the Franks, but I actually think this one's a little bit better. Yeah, if humanity did go out and colonize other planets, for example, we would all have that metaphysical loyalty to the human center, which is Earth, to the human principle, which is presided over by a certain functional leader, which would be most likely a president or something like that. But the idea is that in this case, it is a group of people who follow a certain tradition, who have a certain traditional unity to them. So like an ethnic unity and a religious unity, and a historic unity as well, not like an ancestor or something like that, common ancestral heritage. They are presided over by a regal figure of that same function, without even having any type of political ties or material ties whatsoever. In the same way that if we were to colonize other planets, let's say there were separate states for each planet, and they govern themselves more or less homogeneously. Autonomously, yeah. They would, again, still have that spiritual, even if it is psychological loyalty to humanity over whatever planet it is that they're taken over, because they have that metaphysical connection to humanity. Yeah, that was a really good example.
Oh, thank you. It's kind of just translating Evola's thoughts into a more modern context, because he did live to see the moon landing and everything else, but
just barely.
I'm sure he wasn't thinking that the human race is going to be colonizing other planets anytime soon. And just 50 years after his death, we're already considering that and having steps move forward to actually doing that. So it's a much closer reality than any of us think, but those same principles still apply even in this greater context beyond just the rock we live on. So it really would make these principles universal, because now it's out amongst the stars where everything gets a bit more complex, and then we're really scaled back down to this this primitiveness that we look from a modern context upon in the past, even though that shouldn't be the case at all. It's our ancestors that should be judging us on our own merits and adherence to what they did to build for us. And right now it's degenerating to a point where we may not be able to have that centrality amongst the stars through Earth and further colonies, because that spiritual essence isn't there to legitimize that expansion in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And sorry, there's a Windows notification. Anyways, yeah. So again, this idea, he backs it up again with the fact that if this were to decay, if this spiritual centrality were to decay, then it would be, then what is an organism would become a mechanism. And so it would no longer be an organic traditional unity or a universal type or a traditional centrality. It would be a type of political centrality, which needs to be exerted by force. And so that's the idea of Plato's. Was it Plato, the one who was presented with, well, what if I just take power over you because I force myself on top of you, type of thing.
Yes, I forget the people involved in that conversation, but I was fairly certain it was Plato. I just forget the dude who
Plato or
was
Socrates,
in
maybe.
opposition to him.
Yeah. Anyways,
No, I don't think it was Socrates, but
no.
yeah.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about, but it's that same type of principle where Plato, what Plato's talking about is the right, like not, I guess the correct or the proper form of civilization, and what his opposition is talking about is an upheaval or a usurpation of that proper form by a lesser being or by a lesser caste or what have you, that needs to exert that position by force because they no longer have that quality, that traditional quality. So, again, it's a what Plato's talking about is the proper form, and what the opposition is talking about is the improper form. And so, what Evola's talking about here, that spiritual universality, that spiritual centralism, that spiritual authority, being that universalizing factor, is the proper form. But if there were an empire that had some type of power over its subordinate nations or peoples or whatever, that was not a proper form, then that would become something that is inferior to the idea of the imperial principle and inferior to the ideal of every other national principle or traditional principle that comes after the imperial one. So that's kind of the idea of this chapter right here, which does kind of conclude our reading of it. Do you have anything else to add before we kind of just wrap it up?
No, I was going to mention his example of Mog and Magog, or Gog and Magog, and how that illusion's broken of the trumpets blaring to keep the people subordinate from uprising, and then they do anyways. But that just demonstrates the point that you just made, anyways.
Yeah, it's kind of all the same thing. But so yeah, what are your closing thoughts on all of these chapters and all that good stuff?
Like we said in the beginning, this was a look biologically at human civilization and not just breaking it down to its components and looking at things from a scientific point of view, because the modern error in doing so, or even the postmodern error in doing so, takes things in this scientific sense, isolates them, and then demonstrates how they work on their own devices. But then when it's put back into the totality of society, it doesn't work or function the same way. And that's why a lot of these postmodernist theories don't work or are a hyper reality construction of some true point that they're trying to identify. And Evola does a good job here, taking all the points we just discussed over the last hour and a half, 2 hours, to culminate this organism, like he said, of society and how it perpetuates itself further in both a spiritual legitimacy and the physical maintenance of that spiritual legitimacy. Like we've said before, taking those spiritual problems and solutions and translating them into physical actions. That's basically it on my end.
Yeah, yeah. I think these chapters did a good job at detailing what exactly it is. He does a very good job at detailing the essential idea of the chapter without getting too much into form. I do have that critique of him of his details that he brought about in the idea of the cast of regality, or the relationship between royalty and priesthood. I think he's generally correct on, like I said, the relationship between royalty and priesthood, but what exactly it is that royalty is where I think he goes wrong with that. But everything else I think is generally agreeable, and it all has that same fundamental value to it, which is identifying the principles by which a traditional society is supposed to be sustained, both religiously, politically, and not necessarily economically. He kind of gets to that later. But I talked a little bit about the idea of the proper form of a civilization, and generally speaking, in the world of tradition, the idea goes as follows. It's the religious, and I don't mean that in the devotional sense. I mean that in the spiritual function. There's the spiritual function, which is followed by the political function, which is followed by the economic function, which is followed by the laborious function. And those are generally the four. If you want to get rid of the laborious and just take the and just like bunch it in with the economics, you still have those three. You have the religious, the political, and the economic function, and one follows the other. And this is kind of what he details in these chapters right here. He details the idea of regality being supreme, that supreme universalizing factor, and then he carries on with the idea of royalty or of temporal power, following that idea of regality. And then he talks a little bit about the organization of castes in subordination to that. But I think these chapters did a good job at detailing the first two principles in that sequence at the very least, and leads into the next two chapters quite well. But yeah, I've pretty much exhausted my list of notes. How about you?
Same here.
All right, then I would like to thank everybody for listening into today's podcast. Be sure to leave it a like if you did enjoy it, and if you have something to add, feel free to leave a comment. Thank you once again, Cody.
As always.
My name is Vincent, and I hope to see you back here next time at the Praxis Table Talks.